Okay, I do have a long lesson today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And hopefully, I know some others are still on their way, and there's others that are sick today, so we're just going to go ahead and get going. Starting a new era today. So let's pray, and we'll get going. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this day. I thank you for your word. I thank you for your spirit. I thank you that you love to teach us about yourself. I pray, Lord, that you would help me to speak rightly of you. I pray for those who are still on their way, that you would bring them safely here through all this traffic. And for those that are sick, I pray that you would heal them and help them to recover quickly so that they can serve one another and serve you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. Looking at the books of the Bible. So the first 5 are called the law, but they also are part of the history, written by Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Genesis covers both the creation and the patriarchs era. And then the next 4, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, cover the Exodus era. Then we get into the rest of the history books. Joshua covers the conquest era. Judges and Ruth cover the Judges era, which is what we talked about last week. Now we're going to get into the Kingdom era, which will be 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st Samuel is what we're going to be talking about today. So that is where's my pointer? All right, those are the history books. And we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, which is the songs and the wisdom literature. Then all of these are prophets. And last week we got up to Hosea. And today we will be going through Joel, Amos, and Obadiah. So we're going to go ahead and sing up through Obadiah. You're going to want to probably sing more because you know it, but we'll just try to remember to stop at Obadiah. Ready? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, and then the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, now the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. I know we want to go on. All right, do one more time, a little bit faster, up through Obadiah. Ready? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, and then the book of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, now the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah. Okay, good. All right, the first era. What are the 4 points? The first era is the creation era. What are the 4 points of the creation era? All right, creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel. So when we think of the Tower of Babel, we think of new nations, new languages, split into different nations. It kind of helps us remember what's going to come next. God is going to make his own nation. So the next era is the patriarchs. And the 4 points are, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So God is going to make a new nation, and he's going to start with one man and his wife, Abraham and Sarah, right? And then Abraham has Isaac, and of course they move over to this land here, and God says, okay, your descendants will have this land. They're going to be a whole nation. They want this land right here. And remember what we said last week. The reason God picked that land is that all of the nations at the time were mostly just up here, over here, or over here. And so there was a major trade route that went right through here. And that's where he wanted his people to be when they would become a nation. He wanted them to be right in the middle of everything. So that as people from other nations are traveling through, what was supposed to happen is that people would say, wow, this nation just seems so blessed. Who is their God? And then the Israelites were supposed to say, well, our God is Yahweh, and we follow him, and he blesses us. And supposedly the other nations would say, well, we want your God too. We want to join you. Now we will see that the Israelites totally failed at that, but that doesn't mean that God's plan has failed. Ultimately, it is Jesus who will be born into this nation, in this land, that will be the one that shows us exactly what the Father is like, and people will say, I want to belong to this God. So Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, which is that's why they are called the Israelites. And Jacob has 12 sons, and all of these 12 sons are going to be part of this nation. In fact, they are all the patriarchs of this nation. They're the heads of their tribes, the Reubenites and the Simeonites and Levites and Judahites and Danites and Naphtalites or whatever, all the way down through Benjamin. But we really focus in on Joseph as the final point of the patriarchs era because that's how they get down to Egypt. So at the end of the patriarchs era, they are down in Egypt. All right, so now we go 400 years later, they need to get out of Egypt. What era is that? Exodus, all right? And the 4 points of the Exodus era are? Right, deliverance, law, Kadesh Barnea, 40 years of wandering. The deliverance is all of those plagues that God brought, including the Passover. And listen, those plagues not only were to let the Israelites know how powerful their God was, it was also to let the Egyptians know how powerful Yahweh, the Lord, is. So much more powerful than even the gods that they have imagined. But it also let all of the nations of the world at that time know how powerful Yahweh would be. And they would not forget that. For hundreds of years, the other nations would be, oh, we know what God that is. That's the God that did all that stuff down in Egypt. It seems like the other nations would remember that longer than the Israelites would remember that. The Israelites kind of seemed to forget what God had just done for them. And so they would complain and gripe and not trust him and not believe him. But the other nations would remember, oh, we know what that God did. Hundreds of years they would be talking about what Yahweh had done in Egypt to get them out. Of course, they crossed the Red Sea. They end up down at Mount Sinai to get the law. Now, when God gave them the law, which is a covenant, we talk about the blessings of the law and the curses of the law. If you do certain things, God will bless you. If you don't do certain things, bad things will happen. But you have to realize that every good king, every good ruler of a nation is going to give their people very good laws if they're a good king. Can you imagine living in a nation where there are no laws? We could murder each other, we could steal from each other. It would be a terrible place. We need to have laws, right? Because people are sinful. So God, as a good king, gave them good laws. These laws were very, very good. I mean, it wasn't like when the Canaanites would imagine their gods and the Egyptians would imagine their gods, they would imagine that these gods were mean and they had to try to do things to convince their gods to help them. No, they did not imagine that their God would love them. And so they just imagined we gotta beat ourselves up and we gotta do bad things, all these terrible things to try to convince our gods to help us out. And God wasn't like that at all. So God's laws were very good. They were very reasonable. It's not like they were, climb up to the top of Mount Everest barefoot 10 times a year and you've got to beat yourself up and then maybe I'll help you. God wasn't like that at all. He said, I love you. I want to bless you. Sometimes he let them get a little bit thirsty to see what they were going to do. Are you going to trust me? Are you going to ask me? Or are you going to gripe and complain? And they always gripe and complain, right? They didn't trust him. And he kept doing things for them just to see if he could finally get them to the point where they would trust him. And they kept not believing him. But his laws were good. So it's not like they had to try to convince God to please, will you just give us some water? He wanted to give them water. He wanted to bless them. He just wants them to know it comes from me. It doesn't come from all these other gods that you are trusting or that other nations are trusting. These laws were good. And even though he knew people weren't going to keep all of the laws all the time because people are sinners, he even set up a sacrifice system. Like if you did tell a lie or you just stole something you weren't supposed to, you need to pay it back. But you also can bring sacrifices, and the Lord would overlook or cover over their sins for the time being, always knowing that he was going to send the final sacrifice through Jesus Christ. If he wasn't going to send the final sacrifice, those animals that they were sacrificing would not have paid for their sins. That was just kind of a symbol of what was coming. He knew that the final sacrifice was coming. And so it is their faith in the Lord and faith in believing and trusting in him, trusting he was going to send somebody. That is what saved the people in the Old Testament. So they left from there, went up to Kadesh Barnea, and you know what happened there? They didn't believe that God could help them go into the land, so they would have to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. The adults would raise their children, and the adults died out, and the kids grew up and it's going to be the kids that would get to go into the promised land. They ended up on this side of the Jordan River. They took some land over here from these two kings, Og and Sihon. And then Moses died, and now Joshua's the new leader. They're going to go into the promised land. It is time to conquer the land. So what is the next era? Conquest. And the 4 points of the conquest era. Right, Jordan, across the river Jordan. Jericho, that's the first battle they had. The walls fell down. Rahab joined them. Then they conquered the whole land. Then they divided it all up into the different tribes and assigned the different tribes. And Joshua said, listen, you now have your tribe area. We have gotten rid of the big cities of Canaanites. Now you need to get rid of the Canaanites in your land, in your territories. And they did not do that, especially their kids grew up, and they didn't do that, and then their kids grew up. And so we started into this cycle of really bad times. We call that the Judges era. The Judges era, the 4 points are Judges, rebellion, cycles, and Ruth. Right? So they would start to go and worship the gods that the Canaanites were worshiping. So let's say they go into their territory and it hasn't rained for a little while. And so they go to the Canaanites. The Canaanites are like, well, I don't know about your God. Maybe your God is the God of the wilderness, but the God that makes it rain here is that one over there. And you've got to go and do this and this and this and this and this. And we all have to do this to try to convince this God to be nice, to make it rain. And so the Israelites started worshiping these other gods and doing these terrible things to themselves and to their children, and to try to convince these gods who they couldn't imagine loved them. They were trying to convince these gods to make it rain. Well, they're not real gods, right? So they can't make it rain. And so the Lord had told them, if you're going to do that, I will step back and I won't bring rain, so that you can see that these gods aren't doing that. They're not going to bring rain for you. And so they would get into all these problems, and their Canaanites would attack them and steal their food and make them servants and kill them, and they would have all these problems, and they'd cry out to the Lord, and the Lord would raise up a leader called a judge to help them out, to kind of get an army together and to save them. Then they'd go right back into sinning again. So they had these, what we call these cycles. They would disobey the Lord. God would allow their enemies to make life difficult for them. They would pray to God for help. He would raise up a leader, a judge to help them out. And then they'd go right back into sinning. And this kept going on and on, these cycles of sin, suffering, supplication, prayer to the Lord, and salvation, back into sin again, over and over for like 300 years. And there was some really awful sin that they got involved in because they were mixed up with the Canaanites, and the Canaanites were really terrible sinners. So you had different judges in different areas. We talked about Othniel and Deborah and Gideon. Also Samson, Jephthah was over here. Different areas at different times, he raised up these judges, these leaders. And the only good story in the whole time of the judges is the story of Ruth. So Ruth was from Moab. Remember, the Moabites were descendants of... Nope. Esau is Edom. Moab and Ammon are descendants of... Lot. Yeah, Terah, Abraham, and Abraham's brother. And so Abraham's nephew, Lot. So the Ammonites and the Moabites were descendants of Lot, but the Moabites really got on God's bad side because they were being really mean to the Israelites. But Ruth, who was a Moabite woman, decided to give up her gods, and she wanted to go into Israel, to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law, and worship the true God. And so she chose Yahweh, the true God, and put her gods behind her. So you remember the story. She ends up getting some grain from a man's field, a man named Boaz, and in the end, he marries her. Then we have, and they're like, oh, that's a nice little story. Why is it in there? Is it just to give us a little nice thing that happened during the time of the judges? Well, the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, and that tells us why that story is in there. So the genealogy starts with Jacob's son Judah, his fourth son. And Judah had a son named Perez, who had some descendants who had son, grandson, great-grandson, down to a guy named Salmon. And it is Salmon that married, do you remember who? Rahab from Jericho. And then Salmon and Rahab had either a son, possibly a grandson, or a great-grandson, we don't know, a descendant named Boaz. And so Boaz would have known the story of his either mother or grandmother or great-grandmother Rahab, how she had been a Canaanite, but she gave up her gods and joined the Israelites. And so it is Boaz that marries Ruth. Right? So far, it's like, okay, that's a nice little story. They have a son named Obed. Okay, that's really nice. Obed will grow up. They'll have a son named Jesse. Now, people who are reading it are like, oh, I know who Jesse is. And then Jesse would grow up and have 8 sons, and the youngest would be named David. And so people reading this would say, oh, so this is where David came from. So even though things were so bad during the time of the judges and the people turned away from the Lord and turned away from the Lord, and he kept rescuing them and coming after them and trying to get them to turn back to him, he was still carrying out his plan. He's still going to bring about the Savior. But first he's going to bring about a person who's going to be a very godly king. So the end of Judges says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, which was like total disaster. Now remember, they've had a leader. They had a leader named Moses, who was a leader over all of them. Moses would hear from God. Okay, here's what God wants us to do. Here's what God says. Here's what God said. He'd realize these were God's people. Right? Moses was not like, I'm the king, you all serve me. That was never like that. And Joshua took over. Joshua was never like, okay, build me a palace. You're all my servants. I'm now the... No, he went to the commander of the Lord's army. What do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Let's listen to the Lord. Joshua never built a palace. He never had a bunch of servants do stuff for him. He never took taxes from people. That's not the kind of leader that Joshua was. What they needed was a leader to unite them all back together again and point them back to God. That's the kind of leader or ruler or king even that they needed. Well, we'll see what happens. But when they look at the genealogy at the end of Ruth, they realize, oh, the king that they needed was Ruth's great-grandson. It was David. But even David, we'll even find out today, and the next lesson, next time we have a next lesson, we'll find out David, who we really like him, and he has a heart for the Lord, and even he doesn't do everything right. Even he does things like, really, David, why did you do that? Because he's a human being and he's sinful. So who is the king that we really need? Another descendant of David, another descendant of Ruth and Rahab and Boaz, and another descendant, a further descendant away, and that would be Jesus. That is the king we really need, right? But temporarily, they would need a king who would be a man after God's own heart. All right, so we're getting into the kingdom era now. So the first point of the kingdom era is the kingdom united. They were all one country, and they're going to have a king. After a while, we'll see, not this week, but another lesson, we will see that the kingdom will split in two. And you'll have the northern part will be called Israel, and the southern part will be called Judah. The kingdom, the Israelite kingdom, will be split in two, so it will be divided. All right, so we said at the end of the Judges era, the final judge, the last judge, was a man named Samuel. Samuel's mother had prayed and asked the Lord for a son, and the Lord gave her this boy, and she dedicated this boy, Samuel, to the Lord. She brought him to the tabernacle at Shiloh, where the tabernacle was. She took him to the priest named Eli, and she said, I want to dedicate him to the Lord. I want him to live here in the tabernacle and help you out and serve the Lord for the rest of his life. And so Eli now would be raising Samuel. Now, the problem with Eli had 2 sons. They were grown by this time, and they were serving as priests. So they would be taking people's sacrifices, and they would be supposed to be praying for the people and all, but they were very sinful. They would steal some of the sacrifices for themselves, and they were doing a lot of things that were very sinful. And Eli would say to them, guys, that's probably not a good idea. You shouldn't do that. But he did not stop them. He should have said, you are not going to be priests anymore because you are not representing the Lord well. You are not doing it the way you're supposed to, and you're stealing things, and you're a disgrace. So he just let them be priests. And at the time, the Lord wasn't really saying too much to the Israelites. He really wasn't speaking too much to them. You know why? They weren't listening. He tried and tried and talked to them and talked to them and tried to call them back and tried to get them to repent over and over again, and they wouldn't listen to him. You try to talk to somebody who doesn't listen to you, finally you just stop talking. And so God really hadn't been talking too much to the Israelites. Does that mean God is done with them? Is he fed up with them? No. And the one thing you see about the whole Old Testament is, man, the people would be so sinful, and they kept getting away from the Lord and getting away from the Lord, and he kept coming after them and coming after them, saying, I want you to come back to me. I want to bless you. I love you. And you keep turning away from me, and it's causing you harm. So the word of the Lord was very rare in those days. But he started speaking again. He started speaking to this boy named Samuel. First thing he told Samuel was, I'm about to judge the house of Eli because they are so sinful. And Eli's 2 sons will die on the same day. And I'm going to find a priest from a whole other family, still descendants of Aaron, but I'm going to find a priest from another family. So as Samuel starts to grow up, God keeps speaking to him more and more and more. So Samuel will grow up, and he will do some priestly things. He will also function as a judge. People will come to him with their arguments and things, and he would help settle their arguments. But he was also a prophet. God would speak to Samuel, and Samuel would speak to the people. But God is not done with his people. He hasn't given up on his people. Even though they hadn't repented and they hadn't turned back to him, he still wants to speak to them, and he does it through Samuel. So as Samuel grows up, he becomes a prophet. Well, the Israelites are having problems with some of their biggest enemies, which is the Philistines. The Philistines lived right here by the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, down here in this area. And the Philistines had the best weapons. They had weapons made out of iron. So in those days, that technology was greater than what the Israelites had. They were really strong, and they were a real problem for the Israelites. So one day, the Israelites got their army together, and they went into battle against the Philistines. And they lost against the Philistines big time. So they go home, and they go to the Lord and say, why has Yahweh defeated us before the Philistines? Like, why did our God not help us? Now, this has happened in the past. It happened in the time of Joshua. Remember they went to Ai and didn't pray about it, and they had a defeat, and Joshua was on his face before the Lord saying, well, why did this happen? And the Lord said, there's sin in the camp. You need to fix that. Well, here they are asking the same question. Why has the Lord defeated us? But they're not even stopping to get the answer. They're not, and it's an obvious answer. It's because you're not obeying the Lord. So they don't think about that. And they just decide, I know what we'll do. We'll have the priests, the 2 sons of Eli, go into the tabernacle and get the Ark of the Covenant, this golden box that has the 10 Commandments inside. This box is kind of like the symbol of the seat of God, almost like a throne. And why don't we have them go in there? They'll have to cover it up because nobody's supposed to look at it, and carry it out and carry it into battle. When we go into the battle against the Philistines again, we will carry the Ark of the Covenant. That's like carrying God into battle. God has to help us then. Yeah, we'll take that in there, and he just has to help us, right? No telling God they're sorry for their sins. No getting rid of their idols and stuff that they're worshiping. They're still disobedient, but hey, if we take this into battle, then God has to help us. It doesn't work that way. And God wanted to know it doesn't work that way. So the 2 sons of Eli carried this Ark of the Covenant into the battle. And the Philistines saw it coming. And the Philistines were like, oh, this is the God of the Israelites. This is the God that did all those things in Egypt. Again, hundreds of years ago, and they're still worried about that. And so the Philistines were like, we better fight really hard because they've got their God with them. Come on, men, be courageous. We're going to fight really hard. And they did. And they won the battle. The Philistines won the battle. And in the meantime, they killed both of the sons of Eli, and they took the Ark of the Covenant back to their town. The Israelites are like, we lost God. We lost our God. And they go back to Eli. Not only did they tell Eli, both of your sons are dead, and he's like, where's the Ark? Like, we lost the Ark. Eli was just so shocked. He actually fell over and probably had a heart attack. He died from that. So the Israelites are like, what do we do now? Our God, we don't have our God anymore. And the Philistines are like, hey, we captured the Israelite God. So they took this Ark of the Covenant and they put it inside the temple of their God. And their God was named Dagon. And they had this big statue of Dagon there. And like, man, we've got this powerful God that did all those things in Egypt. But obviously our God must be stronger than him because we won this battle. And now we've got both gods. And they put this in the temple of Dagon. The next morning they go in there, and the statue of Dagon has fallen down on its face in front of the Ark of the Covenant. That's odd. So they set it back up. Well, the next day they come in, and not only has it fallen down, its head has come off and its hands have come off. I think that's kind of a symbol of it can't think, it can't talk, it can't speak, can't help you, and can't do anything. Right? And they're like, wow, what's going on here? Well, not only that, the Philistines in that city started getting all these sores and tumors all over their body and getting sick, and some of them died. And they're like, I wonder if this is the God of the Israelites doing that to us. Let's send it to another town. So they would send it to another Philistine town, and those people started having all these sores and tumors all over them and getting sick. Let's send it to another town. Maybe it's a coincidence. And then those people started getting sick, and they're like, okay, I think maybe we better send this thing back. But maybe it's just a coincidence. I don't know. So they got these two cows that had just had baby calves. And they hitched these two cows up to a cart, and they put the Ark of the Covenant on the cart. And they aimed them toward an Israelite city. And they thought, well, naturally, the cows are going to want to come back to their calves. They're going to want to come back to their babies. And if they do, then we'll know it's just a coincidence that we're all getting sick. But if the cows who want to come back to their babies keep on going to the Israelite city, we'll know that this is Yahweh's doing. He's the one that's making us all sick. So they send this cart, and the cows like, moo, moo, they're wanting their babies, but they keep on going. And they head down to a town called Beth Shemesh. It is right over here, an Israelite town. And the Israelites see the ark coming, and they're all happy about it. And so they take the ark off the cart. And some of them are like, ooh, let's look at it. So they look at it, and a whole bunch of people died because they look at it, because they weren't supposed to look at it, that God is holy. And he told them, you are not to look at the ark. And they did. And so they were like, okay, this is kind of freaky. What are we going to do with it? And they took it to this little town right next to them called Kiriath Jearim. And that's where the ark would stay, probably for the next 20 years or so. And in the meantime, they took the tabernacle, which was at Shiloh, and they took it to another nearby town, the town of Gibeon. You remember when Joshua had come into the land, and the Gibeonites kind of made this, pretended to be from far away, and they tricked them into making a covenant. Well, that's their city. So that's now where the tabernacle is. Shiloh was probably destroyed in the battle. So now the tabernacle is here, and the Ark of the Covenant is there. So Samuel goes back to the people and says, listen, you have to repent before the Lord. You need to turn back to the Lord. You need to give up your idols, give up your gods. And so they did that. Then they went into battle against the Philistines, and they won the battle. And they got back some of the cities that they had lost. That's what we need to do, is get back with the Lord. Now Samuel was getting older by this time, and he thought, well, who's going to kind of be a leader after I'm gone? I need to turn the leadership over to somebody. And he decided, I'm going to turn the judgeship over to my two sons. Right? That had not been done before. There were no judges that said, okay, when I'm done being judge, my kid's going to be the next judge, and then his kid. That's what we call a dynasty. Like what if you have a king, and then the king's son becomes the next king, and then that one's son becomes the next king, and that one's son that's a dynasty. We didn't have that with the judges. But Samuel's thinking, well, maybe, we have a good leader. Maybe I'll turn this over to my two sons. The problem with Samuel's two sons is they weren't very good either. They were pretty wicked as well. And now the Israelites are having problems with another enemy, the Ammonites. More descendants of Lot. They're coming over and trying to take some land away from the tribes on the other side of the Jordan River. So the Israelites like, you know what? We don't want your sons to lead after you. What we really want is we want a king like the other nations have. Now, the problem is with this is what they're thinking is we want a king to go out and fight our battles. We want a king to be our hero. We want this man, this human being, to be the one that we are trusting in. They're not looking for someone like a Moses or like a Joshua who would point them back to God and what does God say. They were really rejecting God as their king. Because Samuel kind of gets his feelings hurt, and he goes to God, and God says, listen, Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They are rejecting me. I am supposed to be their king. I'm supposed to tell them what to do, and they have been turning away from me since the time they left Egypt, hundreds of years. Samuel's like, well, what do I do? And the Lord says, you give them a king like what they're asking for. So before you do, you go warn them what this king is going to be like. So Samuel goes to the people and says, listen, he's going to take your sons and daughters to be servants. He's going to take your land to build his palaces on. He's going to take some of your tax money. He's going to take some of your animals. He's going to take. Right? That's not the way Moses was. That's not the way Joshua was. But the kings of the other lands, yeah, I'm king. I'm going to build my palace. You've got to serve me. You've got to pay me. You've got to, I need money to pay for the servants and to feed the servants. That's what they're going to be like. And the people are like, we don't care. We want a king that we can trust in. So God says to Samuel, give them that kind of a king. But God says, I'm picking him out. And so God chose a king, a man from the tribe of Benjamin. You read Judges, you will find out Benjamin had some serious issues in the time of the Judges, especially people from a town called Gibeah. Gibeah, right there. Not Gibeon, Gibeah. And God picks a man from that town. And so that Samuel goes and says, his name is Saul. And he says, you are going to be the king of Israel. And Saul was, why me? But Samuel looks at him, and Saul is tall and handsome and strong. It's like, wow, he looks the part. I mean, he is the ideal person. He's going to lead and be king. So Samuel anoints Saul by anointing. He pours oil on his head, saying, you are going to be, God has chosen you to be the king of his people, king of Israel. And so the first thing that Saul had to do was to lead them into battle. The Ammonites were coming into these lands over here, especially picking on the people of this little town right here. This town is called Jabesh Gilead. Going to cut their ears off and poke out their eyes and just really terrible things to these people. So these people sent word down to Gibeah, where Saul was, saying, please help us, the Ammonites are going to attack us. So Saul gets this army together. Now listen, God gave in to their request. He gave them this man that looks like he would be the best part. God still loves them. God's not like, ha, 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 see what happens now. God loves them. So God put his spirit on Saul. And Saul leads the Israelites into battle against the Ammonites. And they win the battle. And they save the people of Jabesh Gilead. The people of Jabesh Gilead will never forget that. God is going to he's going to help Saul because he still loves his people. So Samuel kind of stands up and gives kind of a farewell address. Okay, you got your king now. I'm just going to back off. But he said, listen, he takes them through their history. God has always been helping you. He has given you leaders when you needed leaders. But you don't really trust him. And now you've asked for a human king like all the other nations. They weren't supposed to be like all the other nations. They were supposed to be different. God is supposed to be their king. That was not a good thing to do. And the people are like, oh man, I guess we shouldn't have done that. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. And Samuel says, listen, don't be afraid. God will not forsake you. He is pleased to make you his people. And I will continue to pray for you. You just need to keep following the Lord, and your king needs to follow the Lord. If you do that, it will be well with you. They're like, okay, we will. So you hear about, and I can't tell you every story along the way, but some of the stories, they're going to fight the Philistines again, and Saul is going to lead them into battle. And Saul's grown son, named Jonathan, is part of the army. And you see a few stories where it almost looks like Jonathan has more faith in the Lord than Saul does. Jonathan's like, hey, the Lord will help us if he wants to, even if we only have a few people. Let's go into battle. He'll take his friend, and they kind of go into battle, and the Lord helps them. And Saul's kind of staying back like, I don't know if we should go or not. Well, it seems like his son Jonathan happens to have more faith in the Lord than even his father Saul does. So Saul sometimes is really afraid. And at one point, Samuel says, listen, Saul, there's a big battle coming up. I want you to go to the town of Gilgal, and I want you to wait for me for 7 days. Wait for 7 days. I'm going to come in that time, and I'm going to offer a sacrifice. And remember, with Samuel comes the word of the Lord. So Saul needs the word of the Lord from Samuel. So go to Gilgal and wait for me for 7 days before you go into battle. So he goes there. Well, the people in the army they're getting scared. And some of them are like, I'm going home. I'm not going to go into this battle. I don't want to do this battle. So Saul sees some of his army leaving. And he's waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally gets to the 7th day, and Samuel hasn't come yet. I'm like, well, I got to have the Lord's blessing. I'm just going to offer the sacrifice myself. So he offers a sacrifice for himself. He wasn't supposed to do that. He's not really waiting on the word of the Lord. He's just panicking. And as he's doing that, up walks Samuel. What are you doing? Well, you didn't come when you were supposed to. You didn't come in the right amount of time. And so I just went ahead and made the sacrifice myself. And Saul says, you were not supposed to do that. You were supposed to trust the Lord. And because you have done this and you've been disobedient and you haven't trusted the Lord, the kingdom will not pass down to your descendants. So basically, he loses the kingdom for his son Jonathan. Jonathan's the crown prince. Jonathan's the one that should take over the kingdom when his father died. That's the way the nations did it. You know, they'd be king, and then his son would be king, and then his grandson would be king. That'd be a dynasty. Basically, Saul's like, you're not going to have a dynasty. It's not going to pass down to your son. It seems like that's kind of harsh for what Saul did, but God knows Saul's heart. Right? It wasn't just a little slip up. And you don't see anything about Saul repenting before the Lord and saying, I'm so sorry, I never should have done that. I should have trusted you. You don't see any of that with Saul. God knows Saul's heart. And we see as time goes on, Saul isn't really a man after God's own heart. And so Samuel says to him, the Lord has already chosen someone else who has a heart for him, a man after his own heart, who will take over the kingdom. But God did give Saul many victories. He had victories over the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites and the Philistines. And he did have a lot of victories because God still cares for his people. He didn't want it to be a total disaster. So another battle came along, and God says to Samuel, tell Saul this. The Israelites have had problems with these people called the Amalekites ever since they left Egypt. Do you remember the battle where Moses had to keep his hands lifted and Joshua was fighting? They were fighting Amalekites. These are people that are descended from Esau. And they were mean back then, and they were still mean hundreds of years later. I mean, some of the meanest of all their enemies. And they would live out in the desert areas, and they would go and attack different cities and raid them and get their stuff. And they were just mean. And God said, I'd said back in the days of Moses, one day I'm going to completely wipe out the Amalekites. So tell Saul, today is the day. This is the day. I want Saul to go down to the Amalekites and wipe them all out. Don't let anything live, including their animals. Don't take anything from them. Nothing that is Amalekite is to survive this attack. So Samuel gives the word to Saul. This is what you're supposed to do. You're doing this for God. This is God's judgment on these people after all these years. So Saul goes into battle. He wins the battle. He's supposed to wipe out all of them. He brings their king home, King Agag. He brings their king home, and they keep some of the sheep. Why do we kill all these really good sheep? The perfectly good sheep and good cows and everything. We'll kill off the sickly ones, but let's bring the good ones home. And so they bring them back to their camp, and Samuel goes to see Saul. And Saul says, well, I did what you said. And Saul has put up this big monument to himself. Kind of shows you a little bit about his heart. And he's like, I did what you said. I just did all of that, And King Agag's like standing right over there. And Samuel's like, okay. Then why do I hear the sound of sheep bleating in the distance? Why do I hear the sound of oxen lowing in the distance? Oh, those. Yeah, well, the men, the soldiers, my men decided to keep those animals alive to sacrifice to your God. Yeah, we just decided we needed some things to sacrifice to your God, so that's why we brought them back. Samuel's like, that's not what God said to do. He says, listen, to obey is better than sacrifice. God doesn't want your sacrifices if you're disobeying him. It doesn't mean anything to him if you're living disobediently. He said, because of this, the Lord is going to take the kingdom away from you. And Saul gets upset, and Samuel's starting to walk away, and Saul grabs a hold of Samuel's robe, and it tears. And Samuel says, the way my robe is tore is the way that God is going to tear the kingdom away from you. It will not, it's going to go to one of your neighbors who's better than you. And Saul's just like, well, just come back and support me and say nice things to people about me so they don't all desert me and everything. But Samuel finally turns to leave, and that is the last time that Saul will ever see Samuel again. Samuel's sad. He's very upset about the whole thing, and he kind of poured a lot into Saul. And he had anointed Saul, and he hoped things would go well with Saul. So Samuel was so disappointed before the Lord. And the Lord's sad too. The Lord's sorrowful too. Now the Lord knew this was going to happen. The Lord had his reasons for picking Saul, who was somebody that the people wanted, but not along with the Lord's will, but they didn't care what the Lord's will was. So he picked Saul for a purpose. It wasn't that he did the wrong thing, but God is sad. He's still sad. He feels sadness about Saul and the direction that Saul went. And so finally God says to Samuel, how long are you going to keep mourning over Saul? I have chosen someone else. I want you to go down to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, grandson of Rahab. Go down to Bethlehem in the territory of Judah right here. And you're going to go to Jesse's house and you're going to anoint one of his sons to be the next king. Saul finds out, right? They can't tell anybody. So he goes down to the house of Jesse down in Bethlehem, right down here. Sneaks down there. And he goes to Jesse and says, God is going to choose one of your sons to be the next king. Got to keep these secrets. And so Jesse brings out his oldest son. His oldest son was named Eliab. And man, Eliab is strong and tall and handsome. And Samuel's like, yeah, that looks like that looks like he'd be a great one. Kind of like Saul had looked like he would be a great king. And the Lord says, no. So don't look on the outward appearance. He says, man always looks on the outward appearance and makes a judgment about someone. He says, I look at the heart. The Lord looks at the heart. He doesn't have a heart for me. He's not the one. And so Jesse would bring the next one in. Nope. And then the next one in. Nope. And the next one in. And he brought all these 7 sons in before Samuel. And the Lord kept saying, no, no, no. Finally, Samuel's like, do you have any other sons? Like, well, I got one more. He's a shepherd boy. He's out tending the sheep. He's the youngest one, probably about 15 years old at the time. He's out with the sheep. Bring him in. We're not doing anything until he comes back in. And so they bring David in, and the Lord's like, that's the one. He has a heart for me. Even at 15 years old, Lord, he is the one who have a heart for me. He is the one who's going to lead people knowing these people are God's people. It's not about him as king. And so Samuel anoints David right there in front of all his brothers. I don't think that all his brothers were too thrilled about that. Why does David get to be king? But that's the one God chose. So he pours his oil on top of David's head. That doesn't mean David is now the king, right? Saul is still king. And God had chosen Saul. This is a secret. Nobody can know this. So David is like chosen, but they can't tell anybody. So at that time, the Philistines, or actually the Lord put his spirit on David, and the Lord took his spirit away from Saul because of Saul's sin, his heart. And he actually sent to Saul a harmful spirit. So Saul would kind of go through these fits of rage sometimes. And his servants were like, well, what are we going to do about this? Saul just goes through these fits of rage. And somebody said, we need somebody to come and play some nice music for him to calm him right on down. And somebody said, I know somebody who plays really nice music. I think he's a great musician. He plays beautiful music on the harp and he sings. How come that somebody was that shepherd boy David? Okay, bring him in. See the hand of God on all of this. So they go to Bethlehem to go to Jesse's house. Hey, can your son come and sing and play before Saul? So David goes. Saul has no idea. David's been chosen to be the next king. And so he goes, he plays with music, and he calms Saul right on down. Saul loves this kid. Man, this kid's really helping me out. So David would kind of go back and forth from his house, from his home, where he'd take care of the sheep, and then he'd go into the service of Saul, and he'd kind of go back and forth. Saul has no idea. Well, now the Philistines are bothering the Israelites again. And the Philistine army is coming against them, and the Israelite has gotten their army together. And David's 3 oldest brothers are in the Israelite army. The Philistines have this hero, this warrior, this giant of a man. You know the story. That's what his name is. Goliath. And Goliath comes out to the Israelite army and says, instead of everybody fighting everybody, here's what we're going to do. You pick out a hero, you pick out a warrior, and he will come and fight me. We'll just do this one-on-one. And if your guy kills me, then our people will serve you. If I kill your guy, then you have to serve us. Well, he's this huge guy with all this armor and everything. And the Israelites are like, ooh, nobody wants to go up and fight Goliath. And for 40 days, he keeps calling out, making fun of them, making fun of their God, just taunting them. Who's going to come out and fight for me? Who's going to come out and fight against me? Now, who should have volunteered to do that? Who did they pick? They had picked Saul to go out and fight their battles. Saul should have said, I'm the king, I need to do this. Saul wasn't going to do it. Nobody was going to do it. Now, David was at home at the time. So David's father said, hey, go check on your brothers and see what's going on. David gets there, and he's like, goes to his brother, what's happening? Are you all fighting? What's going on? And then Goliath goes out there, and he does his big speech and everything, and he's taunting the people. And David's like, why isn't anybody going out and fighting? Don't we have the Lord with us? Don't we have Yahweh? And his oldest brother's like, oh, you little twerp. Let's go back to your sheep. You're just nothing. Just go home. And so David's like, well, I'll talk to somebody else then. So why isn't anybody? We have the Lord. He is making fun of the Lord of hosts. He is making fun of our God. I mean, don't you think our God wants to help us? Well, why isn't anybody doing this? I'll do it. And so they take him to Saul, and they said, Saul, this guy David, he says he'll do it. He'll go and fight Goliath. And Saul's kind of like, well, you don't have the right equipment. You need to have, all this armor and all of this stuff. And he tries to put all this equipment on David, and David's like, I can't fight with this stuff. And then, David, you can't do this. He said, listen, I know I'm just a shepherd, but while I've been a shepherd, there have been lions and bears that have attacked me. And the Lord has helped me with my bare hand kill these lions and bears. Goliath is just going to be like that. The Lord helped me against lions and bears. The Lord can help me against Goliath. But Goliath is making fun of our God. We cannot let that stand. So he says, okay, so you know the story. David has his, 5 little stones, and he's got his slingshot, and he goes up before Goliath. And Goliath sees him coming, and Goliath's like, oh, what are you doing? You're bringing this, a bunch of sticks to me. There's like a little dog coming to me with a bunch of sticks. And David says, you come to me with a sword and a spear. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have made fun of, you have mocked, you have defied him. The Lord will give you into my hand, and all the earth, everyone will know that there is a God in Israel who saves, not with sword or spear. The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hand. And you know the story. He gets that sling going, and that stone goes right into the forehead of Goliath. Evidently his helmet didn't come down far enough, and it goes right into his head, and down goes Goliath. And David runs up and grabs his sword and chops his head off. And that's the end of Goliath. And then all the Israelites go running forward, and they defeat the Philistines in this battle. And so Saul is like, wow, this guy, not only is he a good musician, he's just so brave. It wasn't that he was so brave. It was that he trusted the Lord. And he knew the Lord wanted to help his people. He knew he could trust the Lord. And so the Lord gave him the victory. So Saul's like, I want you to come into my service full time. And he becomes a bodyguard, armor bearer. Then he's going to go out and start fighting some of the enemies. Fighting the animals. The enemies. And, but, Saul has a son. Several sons. His oldest son is Jonathan. Jonathan normally would be the one to take over the throne when Saul dies. He's the crown prince. So you would think that Jonathan would be like, why does my dad like this guy so much? Who does he think he is? This David guy, what? Does he, it kind of feels like he's trying to take my place. Jonathan wasn't like that at all. Jonathan was really impressed with David and David's faith and what David had done, and he got to know David, and I really like this guy. They became like best friends, almost like brothers. Jonathan loved David. David loved Jonathan. They became best friends. It's quite remarkable that Jonathan would feel this way towards towards David. So David started going out into battle. He started leading armies against the Philistines, and he was very successful. Battle after battle, he would win. And at first Saul was like really happy about that. Then after a while, the people started singing all these praises to David more than they were singing any praises to Saul. And Saul now got very jealous of David. Now remember, Saul knows what Samuel said. Saul knows that kingdom is supposed to be taken away from him. He's probably going to try to keep that from happening. He still wants Jonathan to be able to take over the kingdom after him. But maybe he starts getting a little suspicious of David. How come, all these people are now starting to praise him, and I feel threatened by that. And so he gets starting to get very jealous of David, but not Jonathan. Jonathan becomes closer and closer to David, and at one point, Jonathan says, here, take my sword, take my belt, take my royal robe, almost as a symbol of like, take my spot as crown prince. It's amazing that Jonathan would do that. He just recognized that David was following the Lord, and it was more important to Jonathan that they followed the Lord than he get the kingdom for himself. So Saul got so angry at one point. David's playing beautiful music for him, and Saul takes his spear and flings it at David and just about kills David. And David runs out, and maybe David was thinking, well, he was having one of his bad fits and everything, and so he doesn't leave yet. David even marries Saul's daughter. Saul had a daughter named Michal, and he married Saul's daughter. So now he's married to Saul's daughter, and he's best friends with Saul's son. But Saul hates David. He even told Jonathan and some of the servants, y'all need to kill David. He's a threat to us. He's a threat to me. You need to kill David. And Jonathan's like, what? He's never done anything. Why? He's never tried to hurt you. He's only done helpful things for you. Why would you want to do this? And Saul, go and kill him. And Jonathan would have to go and warn David, my father is not in a good mood. You need to stay away. And this kind of kept happening. Another time he threw a spear at David, and David's like, okay, this is pretty serious. And another time his wife had to help him escape from Saul. And this kept happening. And finally, David realizes, I just have to leave. I have to flee and get out of here. And as he starts to leave, Jonathan comes to him and says, listen, I know you're going to be the next king. And I'm not. I know I will be second to you. Maybe I will be, one of your servants or whatever. But promise me, make a covenant with me. Promise me that when you become king, you won't kill off my family. Why would he say that? Well, because in other nations, that's what would happen. If you were a king and somebody else decided he's going to come over and attack and become the next king, what he would do is kill off the first king's family, everybody in the family. So none of them could say, listen, I should be king. My dad was king. I should be the next king. So Jonathan's saying, listen, when you become king, that's what God wants. That's what the Lord wants. I know it's going to happen. Promise me you're not going to kill off my family. We're not going to try to take the throne back from you. So David makes a promise. I will not kill off your family when I become king. So they make this covenant with each other. And Saul finds out that they're close friends, and Saul gets mad at Jonathan and says, don't you realize what's going on here? He's going to take the kingdom from you. You're going to lose the kingdom. And Jonathan's like, whatever the Lord wants, the Lord's kingdom. And Saul even tried to kill Jonathan in one of his fits. So Saul is just getting crazier and crazier and crazier. So David just has to flee. And he runs into the wilderness. There's a lot of stories, and you have to read 1 Samuel because I can't tell all the stories of things that happened. 2 times, David had an opportunity to kill Saul. And David's men were like, you can't, go get him, go get him. The Lord wants you to get him now. He's going to, and David's like, no. He is the one that the Lord chose. The Lord will deal with him when the Lord wants to deal with him. I mean, David doesn't want to be known to the people as somebody who came and killed their king and then took his place. This is up to the Lord. And he said, he's the one that the Lord anointed. I'm going to let the Lord deal with him. So twice he could have killed Saul. And he yells across the valley at Saul, says, I could have just killed you, and I didn't. Why are you chasing me? I'm not a threat to you. I'm not trying to kill you. And Saul's like, oh, I'm sorry. Please come home. Please come home. And David's like, he's not coming home. He doesn't trust Saul. Another time, they were going along 2 separate, 2 hills, and there's kind of a valley in between. And David's and he's got these men that have joined him now. About 600 men have kind of joined his group. And he's like on one side, and here comes Saul and the army on the other side. If you were watching it in a movie, you'd be going, oh, And they're getting closer and closer and closer, and they're just about ready to catch up to David, and then they're going to go and get David, and they don't have a chance, they don't have a chance. And just when Saul's getting closer and closer to David, a servant comes up and tells Saul, the Philistines are attacking. We've got to go fight the Philistines. And Saul has to break off his attack and go after the Philistines. God's rescue. God's taking care of David, but there was some close call. And over time, different things happen. He picks up 2 more wives. Saul gives his wife Michal to somebody else because David can't come home. So he says, here, Michal, you go marry somebody else. David picks up 2 more wives. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but he has 2 more wives. He's out in the wilderness, and he's like, it was wearing him down. And this was years and years of it. Some of the Psalms that he wrote, that are in the book of Psalms, he wrote while he was running from Saul. It was hard. It wore him down. And at one point, he's just like, he's going to get me one of these days. He's just for sure he's going to get me. He just got discouraged. He kind of lost some faith there. And so he decided the smart thing to do, where could he go that Saul wouldn't catch him? Because even some of his own people of Judah were giving David away. They would say, oh, Saul, we know where David's hiding. We know David and his men are hiding. And Saul would come after them. So David's like, where can I go that Saul won't come after me and all these men that I have? So he thinks, here's a smart idea. I'll go into Philistine territory. Saul's not going to come after me in the Philistine territory. He's not going to march into Philistine territory. That's his arch enemies. I'll go to the Philistines and get some help. It doesn't say that the Lord said to do that. One of the priests had actually joined David, and sometimes he could ask the Lord through this priest what the Lord wanted. It doesn't really say that David prayed about this. He was just worn out and worn down and frustrated and fearful, and I think it was just a lack of faith at the time. We all have those times. And so he decided, let's go to the Philistines, and we'll see if they will let us stay in their land, which was a pretty big risk because he had killed a Philistine warrior years before. He'd killed Goliath. So he and his men, and by this time his men had all of their families come join them, right? So the families are like, we can't live at home because Saul will find out and Saul will come and kill us. So they had all their families come with them. So there's David and David's 2 wives and these 600 men and all of their families. And they march into Philistine territory, and they go up to one of the Philistine kings. His name was Achish. So they go up to him and they say, hey, can we stay in your land? It's okay if we stay in your land because, Saul is like, does not like me at all. And Achish is like, yeah, I heard the problems that you're having with Saul. You used to be one of Saul's servants. You used to go and fight battles against us. Yeah, but things aren't good with Saul anymore. And Saul and I are enemies, and I'm not fighting with Saul anymore. And Achish looks at David and he looks at these 600 men and thinks, man, these guys could be a good fighting force for me. So he says, okay, I'll let you stay here. David's like, we don't want to bother you. Is there some little out-of-the-way town that you have that we could stay in? And so Achish says, yeah, there's a little town called Ziklag. You can go stay there. So David and his 600 men go to the little town of Ziklag, and they kind of stay there. And while they're there, they got to have something to eat. So while they're there, again, there's no mention of the Lord in these chapters that I'm talking about here. What they decide to do to get something to eat is there's all these Amalekite camps. What the Amalekites would do is they would go and raid other cities. Sometimes they would raid cities in Judah. Judah is David's people. Sometimes they would go to cities in Judah and raid them and take their stuff and the people and everything. So David says, here's what we're going to do to get food. We're going to go raid the Amalekites. So they became desert raiders to raid the other desert raiders. So we're going to go raid the Amalekites and take their stuff. And we don't want anybody to know we're doing that, so we're going to kill all of the Amalekites while we do this. Seems a little harsh. Doesn't say that the Lord said to do that. You can kind of say, well, they are Amalekites, and God did want them all to, be destroyed at some point, and they have been bothering the people of Judah. But David, it seems like it might be a little bit outside of the will of the Lord. We don't know. But he goes into these camps, these Amalekite camps, and starts raiding them and taking their stuff and killing everybody. So then they have all this stuff, these animals and things, and the king Achish comes over and says to him, hey, what have you all been doing? Where'd you get all this stuff? Well, we have been raiding towns in Judah. We're raiding Judah towns. Achish is like, whew, man, his people must really hate him. He's going and raiding his own people, his own tribe. Whoa, man, they hate him. And of course, David has wiped out all the Amalekites, so nobody can come and tell him any differently. So David is pretending that he's raiding his own towns, and Achish is like, man, they must really hate him. He'll never be able to go back to his people, ever. And so the Philistines decide they are going to go and attack the Israelites. They're going to go into battle against the Israelites. They're going to march up here. There's going to be a big battle right here. And Achish goes to David and said, hey, I need your help. Will you join us? I want your 600 men. Now, I've been helpful to you. Now it's your time to kind of pay me back. I want your 600 men, you and your 600 men, to join me as we go into battle against Saul and Jonathan and the Israelites. What's David going to do? If David says, I can't go into battle against my own people, then Achish is like, you are loyal to your own people. And Achish would go after him. So David's like, sure, now you will see what your servant will do. Yes, we will go into battle. But can David really go and fight against his own people when he's supposed to be king of those people? Are they really going to accept him as king if he goes and fights against them and against Saul and Jonathan? David's in a terrible fix. So David and his men, they kind of join Achish, and they're kind of starting to meet together with all the other Philistine kings. And I don't know what's going through David's head at the time. I'm wondering if David's like, oh, get me out of this, get me out of this, get me out of this. That's what I would be saying. So they're like trying to pretend, okay, yep, we're going to go and help you. So they start marching, and they meet up with some other Philistine kings with their armies. They're all going to join together. The other Philistine kings are like, Achish, who are those guys you're bringing along? Oh, that's David. You know, David used to be the servant of Saul. He used to be the warrior for Saul. He's with us now. He and his men are with us. The other kings are like, are you kidding me? He used to be a servant of Saul. Oh, no. Listen, they hate each other. I mean, and he's even attacking his own people. They don't like him. I mean, yeah, he's with us now. He's not on Saul's side at all. And they're like, listen, how better for David to get back on Saul's side if he goes into battle and then turns on us and fights against us? He could do that. I don't know. Maybe David is thinking that. But he could turn against it. Achish's like, no, he wouldn't do that. No. He's not going to do that. And they're all like, no, he's going with us. He could turn against us in the middle of that battle and support his own people. He is not going. Okay, it could have had this good fighting force. So he goes back to David and says, listen, sorry. You know, I knew you've always been honest with me. Like, you've been honest with me, you know. You told me the truth all the time, and I believe you, and I know you would have gone and been faithful and helped us, but they don't trust you. And David's like, what? What did I do? You know, and you're almost reading this and you're like, David, just shut up and go home. No, don't talk about it. Don't let him change his mind. But he's like, then Achish's like, sorry. I know you're honest and you would have supported us, but you just got to go home, and sorry, you can't fight this battle. So David and his friends, his guys, start marching back down to their town of Ziklag. And I can imagine they're like, whew, man, we got out of that one. That would have been really bad. But when they get back to Ziklag, remember they had left their wives and their children behind. They found the city burned to the ground and there's nobody there. Some Amalekites had raided their city and taken all of the people. They don't know where they are. They don't know what happened to them. And these are their families. And they're devastated. They're crying out to the Lord, and they're praying, and they're pleading, and they're angry, and they're screaming, and they're crying until they didn't have any strength left. And then the men turned to David. This is your fault. Your fault that this happened to us. We've lost all our families, and it's your fault. And they were thinking about stoning David to death. And now it says, David strengthened himself in the Lord. He went to the Lord. And then he went to the priest and said, ask the Lord for me what I should do. Shall I go and try to find our people? And the Lord answers back, yes, you will be successful. Go and find your people. So they don't know where to look, but they start marching kind of out into the wilderness, and they run across this Egyptian guy who is kind of sick, and he needs water, and he needs food, and they're like, who are you? And he says, well, I was a servant of this Amalekite guy, and I was sick, and they just left me out here. And they gave him some water, and they gave him some food, kind of help him kind of revive a little bit. And he says, yeah, I was with these Amalekites, and we went and raided the city of Ziklag. Ziklag? You were with the people that raided Ziklag? Yeah. Do you know where they are? Oh, yeah, I'll show you where they are. If you don't kill me, I'll show you where they are. So it just so happened that they found this man who showed them where the city was. And all the Amalekites were drunk, and they're all like, oh, yeah, we're so great and everything. And David was able to attack and get all of his people back, all of this stuff back, plus some extra stuff. And you know what he did with the extra stuff? He went to different towns in Judah. So here's a gift for you. Oh, here, this is for you all. Oh, I want you to have this. Why is he doing that? He's very wisely trying to get them to like him. Like, here's some things I got. I know they've been raiding you. Here, giving you some stuff back. Just being nice here. I just want you to know I'm for you. So in the meantime, Saul's really worried about this battle. The Philistine kings have gotten together and they're marching up here, and Saul is really, really worried. But Saul's not hearing from the Lord at all anymore. The Lord just isn't talking to him. Saul actually killed off a lot of the priests. Because he thought the priests were helping David. So he got in a rage and killed off the priests, except the one that escaped and joined David. And so now he's really worried. He's like, I got to hear something. I got to know something. And so he finds out that there's this woman who supposedly contacts the spirits of dead people. Now, probably what she was really doing was contacting demons. And that was outlawed by God. There wasn't supposed to be anybody in Israel that did that. And even Saul at one point said, if there's anybody that does that, they are not allowed in Israel. But there was this woman that was there in a little town called Endor. We call her a witch or a fortune teller. She called up these spirits, supposedly of the dead, but probably they were demons. And so he found out where she was. He disguised himself, and he went to her house. He said, I hear that you call up spirits of the dead, that we can talk to them. And she's like, that's illegal. Nobody's supposed to be doing that, and like, no, it's okay. Well, she said, listen, if Saul found out, I'm dead. No, Saul's not going to find out. Of course, it was Saul dressed up and disguised himself. I just need you to call up, I need you to call up the spirit of Samuel. I know it died by this time. I need you to call up the spirit of Samuel. I just need to talk to him. She said, well, okay, I'm going to tell you, but no, okay. So anyway, so she calls up this spirit. And I don't know if she was shocked to actually see Samuel, and she didn't really expect it to be really Samuel, but she calls up the spirit of Samuel. And at that moment, she realizes that's Saul that has asked her to do this. And she screams because she thinks Saul's going to kill me. He's like, I'm not going to kill you. I need to talk to Samuel. And Samuel says, why have you called me up for my rest? He said, the Lord is not speaking to you because you stopped listening to him. You stopped obeying him. And he said, tomorrow in the battle, you and your sons will be with me, and Israel will lose the battle. Saul's devastated. He doesn't want to eat anything. And the woman's like, you really need to eat. You're the king. Go back. You need to go. So finally he goes back and he goes into the battle. And they fight the Philistines. Just as Samuel had said, the Philistines won the battle. In the process, they killed Jonathan. They killed 2 other sons of Saul. And they wounded Saul. And Saul turned to his armor bearer and said, you need to kill me. I don't want the Philistines to kill me. Just go ahead and kill me. And the armor bearer's like, I'm not going to kill you. So Saul falls on his own sword and dies there on this mountain called Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines are taking some of the cities, and they're so happy, and they've won this battle, and they take the bodies of Saul, and they kind of put them up on the wall to gloat about it. And some people in the little town of Jabesh Gilead, remember this is the first city that Saul had helped, back when Saul first became king, the Ammonites were attacking them. They went over to Mount Gilboa, and they got the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and the 2 other sons and took them back to Jabesh Gilead and gave them a decent burial. And that's how 1 Samuel ends. It's really sad. And this is, David doesn't know it yet. David doesn't know what's happened. The people are scattered. The people run home. Their king is dead. The crown prince is dead, and the next two sons are dead. What's going to happen next? Who's going to be their leader? What is going to happen? They don't know what's going on. The Philistines have won this battle. And David doesn't know this yet. And we'll find out next time, but I'll give you a little hint. Saul has another son back at home. His name is Ishbosheth. Is Ishbosheth going to say, well, then that makes me king? Isn't David supposed to be king? David's in the land of the Philistines. He's been hiding out from he's been like kind of enemies, or they've been mad at him, or enemies chasing him. What's going to happen? Now, what I think is sad is the story of Jonathan, and yet it's encouraging as well. Jonathan was always a faithful friend to David. He supported David. He warned David. He would never go against David, but he was also a loyal son to his father and loyal to his people. And he went into battle. He supported his father because that's his role. That's where God had him. He supported his father even though his father had gotten crazy. And he supported his people and went into battle and gave his life for his people. And I read that someone said, as though Jonathan gave up a kingdom he knew was not his to have an eternal kingdom with the Lord. Jonathan went to be with the Lord. You know that David's there with him now. And you know that Jonathan is glad that he lived his life the way that he did, with faith in God. This is God's deal. This is God's kingdom. It wasn't for Jonathan to claim the kingdom. Jonathan remained faithful to David and faithful to the father and the people that he was called to serve. So that's like a good story in all of this. But David doesn't know it yet, and we're going to find out what happens when David finds out what happens to Saul and to his best friend, Jonathan. Do you want to go ahead and have class 2 weeks? That's okay? Okay, good. We'll have one more class before Christmas and find out what happened. Good job. Thank you.